This Korean drama love story begins on a rainy evening in Seoul. The rain in Seoul had a different sound than it did back home. This Korean drama love story begins on a rainy evening in Seoul. The rain in Seoul had a different sound than it did back home. Softer somehow. Like it was apologizing for interrupting the evening. Ariana Brooks stood at the window of Min-jae's apartment, watching the city lights blur through the water streaming down the glass, and thought about how many small things had changed since she'd moved here. The way she bowed without thinking now. The way she removed her shoes at every doorway. The way she'd learned to read silence as its own language. Behind her, she heard Min-jae moving through the kitchen, the gentle clink of ceramic cups, the whisper of steam from the kettle. These were the sounds of her life now. Quiet, private. She'd met Kang Min-jae 2 years ago at a language exchange cafe in Gangnam. She'd been teaching English at a private academy, still adjusting to the rhythm of Seoul, still learning which subway exits led where and how to order coffee without fumbling through her phone's translation app. He'd been sitting alone at a corner table, reading a book in English. Hemingway, she remembered, because the cover had been so worn she could barely make out the title. He'd looked up when she passed, and their eyes had met for just a moment. Long enough for her to notice his were kind. Long enough for him to notice she'd noticed. That should have been all. A glance between strangers in a city of 10 million. But the cafe was crowded, and the only empty seat was across from him, and when she gestured awkwardly at the chair, he'd smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, and nodded. They'd talked for 3 hours that first day. About books and teaching and the strange loneliness of living in a language that wasn't your own. He told her he worked for his family's trading company, something vague and corporate that he didn't seem to want to discuss. She told him about growing up in Atlanta, about her parents' initial worry when she decided to move halfway around the world, about the way Korean students wrote their English letters with such careful precision it sometimes made her heart ache. He'd laughed at that. Soft laugh, almost shy. "We're taught that perfection is a form of respect," he'd said. "And what happens when you can't be perfect?" she'd asked. His smile had faded slightly. "Then you learn to hide your mistakes very well." She hadn't understood. Then what he meant? Not really. But that was 2 years ago. Now, standing in his apartment while rain painted the windows, she understood more than she wanted to. "Chamomile or green tea?" Min-jae asked, appearing beside her with 2 cups balanced in his hands. His hair was slightly damp from the shower, falling across his forehead in that way that made him look younger than 32. "Chamomile," she said, taking the cup. Their fingers touched briefly, warmly. "Thank you." They moved to the couch together, a choreographed dance they'd perfected over countless evenings like this one. Her feet tucked under his leg. His arm draped across the back of the cushions, his fingers absently playing with the ends of her braids. The television played something neither of them was watching. Outside, the rain continued its gentle apology. "My mother called today," Min-jae said after a while. His voice was casual, but Ariana felt the tension in how carefully he'd chosen to speak. In the 2 years they'd been together, Madame Kang Sunhwa had called often, but Min-jae had never mentioned these calls so directly before. Ariana kept her eyes on her tea. "What did she want?" "She wants to meet you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy despite their simplicity. Ariana felt her chest tighten. They'd discussed this before. The inevitable moment when their private world would have to intersect with his family. Min-jae had always been protective of what they had, keeping it separate, safe. His parents knew he was seeing someone. They knew she was American. They knew she taught English. They didn't know she was black. They didn't know she had no interest in joining their social circles or their business networks. They didn't know that when Min-jae looked at her, he saw not a strategic alliance or a suitable match, but simply the woman who made him laugh, who challenged him, who knew him as just Min-jae. Not Kang Min-jae, heir to a legacy older than modern Seoul itself. "When?" Ariana asked. "Sunday. Lunch at their home in Busan." Busan. She repeated the word, tasting the distance in it. Busan wasn't just another city. It was where the Kang family roots went deepest, where tradition wasn't a concept but a living, breathing expectation. Min-jae's fingers stilled in her hair. Ariana. We don't have to. Yes, we do. She turned to look at him, and something in her chest ached at the worry she saw in his face. He was gentle, her Min-jae. Gentle and loyal and deeply, painfully conflict avoidant. She'd known this about him from the beginning. It was part of why she loved him, this softness in a world that often demanded hardness. But lately, she'd begun to wonder if gentleness was enough. I want to meet them, she said, and she meant it. Mostly. He pulled her closer, pressed a kiss to her temple. They'll love you. Ariana didn't answer. She just listened to his heartbeats, steady and sure, and wondered why he felt the need to lie. The train to Busan took less than 3 hours, but it felt longer. Ariana watched the landscape change through the window. Seoul's dense urban sprawl giving way to mountains and rice fields, modern Korea yielding to something older, something that had existed long before bullet trains and glass skyscrapers. Min-jae held her hand the entire way. He'd dressed carefully that morning in a dark suit. His hair styled precisely, and she'd realized with a small shock that this was a different Min-jae. Not her Min-jae, who wore soft sweaters and read Hemingway in coffee shops, but Kang Min-jae, the son who carried expectations like a second skin. She'd dressed carefully too. A simple navy dress, elegant but not ostentatious. Pearl earrings her mother had given her. Hair pulled back into a low bun. She'd looked at herself in the mirror that morning and felt like she was preparing for battle, armor made of fabric and good posture. The Kang family home sat on a hillside overlooking the sea. It was traditional in structure. Curved tile roofs, dark wooden beams, stone walls that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. But the size of it, the manicured gardens, the subtle markers of wealth in every carefully placed lantern and sculpted tree, these spoke of power that didn't need to announce itself. A woman in a simple grey hanbok answered the door. She bowed without speaking and led them through corridors that smelled of beeswax and age. Ariana's heels clicked against the polished wood floors, each step a small intrusion on the silence. They found Madame Kang Sun-hwa in a sitting room that overlooked the garden. She was exactly what Ariana had expected and nothing like it at the same time. Elegant, yes. Poised in a way that seemed effortless. Her hanbok was cream-colored silk with delicate embroidery at the collar. Her hair swept back in a style that revealed a face that must have been beautiful in youth and remained striking in age. But it was her eyes that caught Ariana, dark and intelligent and utterly unreadable. "Mother," Min-jae said, his voice formal. He bowed, and Ariana followed, lowering her head in the deepest bow she knew how to give. Madame Kang rose gracefully. "Min-jae." Her gaze moved to Ariana, a sweep of assessment so quick it might not have happened at all. "And you must be Ariana. Please sit." They settled onto cushions around a low table where tea had already been prepared. Madame Kang poured with practiced precision, each movement deliberate, each gesture carrying meaning Ariana couldn't quite read. This was a performance, she realized. A test dressed as hospitality. "Min-jae tells me you teach English," Madame Kang said, her English crisp and accent light. "At an academy in Gangnam, yes?" "Yes," Ariana said, accepting her cup. "I've been there for 3 years now. I work primarily with middle school students." "How noble." Madame Kang's smile was pleasant, empty. "Teaching is important work. My own mother was a teacher many years ago. Before her marriage, of course." The emphasis was light, barely there. Before her marriage. Ariana felt Min-jae shift beside her. "Education remains important to our family," Madame Kang continued. "Min-jae's father and I met at university. I was studying economics. He was in business management. We understood from the beginning that we could build something together. Something lasting." "Mother," Min-jae began, but she held up a delicate hand. "I'm simply making conversation, Min-jae." She turned her attention back to Ariana. "You're from America. Atlanta, is that correct?" Yes. Such a vibrant city. I visited once many years ago. So much energy. The word hung in the air, not quite a compliment. Korea must be very different for you. It is, Ariana said carefully. But I've grown to love it here. The culture, the language, the people. I feel very fortunate to have made a life in Seoul. A life. Madame Kang repeated the phrase thoughtfully. Yes, life is what we make of it, isn't it? Though some lives fit together more naturally than others. The conversation continued like this for the next hour. Madame Kang asking questions that seemed innocuous but landed like small cuts. Ariana answering with as much grace as she could muster. Min-jae growing quieter and quieter beside her. They talked about Korea's education system, about American politics, about the weather and the tea and the garden that was just beginning to bloom. They did not talk about Min-jae and Ariana's relationship. They did not talk about the future. They did not acknowledge that this lunch was anything more than a polite meeting between a mother and her son's acquaintance. It was only when they were leaving, standing in the Genkan while putting on their shoes, that Madame Kang said something that felt true. It was lovely to meet you, Ariana. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light from the garden. Min-jae has always been sensitive, thoughtful, sometimes too much so. He feels deeply, my son. It's a beautiful quality, but also. She paused, choosing her words with the same precision she'd used to pour tea. It can make him vulnerable to temporary attachments. Ariana felt Min-jae's hand on her elbow, gentle but insistent. His father and I only want what's best for him, Madame Kang continued. We've worked very hard to ensure he has the foundation for a good life. Proper life. I'm sure you understand. I understand that Min-jae is an adult, Ariana said, her voice steadier than she felt. Capable of making his own choices. Madame Kang smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. Course. But choices made without understanding their consequences are simply mistakes waiting to happen. The train back to Seoul was quieter than the one they'd taken that morning. Ariana watched the landscape reverse itself, ancient giving way to modern, mountains flattening into urban sprawl. Min-jae sat beside her, his hand on hers, but he said nothing. The silence between them was different now. Heavier. She was polite, Ariana finally said. Very polite. Min-jae exhaled slowly. I'm sorry. For what? For. He gestured. Helplessly. All of it. Ariana turned to face him. In the late afternoon light filtering through the train window. He looked exhausted. Min-jae. What did she mean about temporary attachments? He looked away. She's traditional. She has certain expectations. What expectations? The silence stretched. Outside, the landscape blurred past Korea in motion. Min-jae. Ariana's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. What aren't you telling me? He met her eyes then, and she saw something there that made her stomach drop. Fear. Guilt. And underneath it all, a grief that hadn't happened yet. There's someone, he said quietly. Someone my parents have been considering. For a long time. The world didn't stop. The train kept moving. The sun kept filtering through the window. But something fundamental shifted. A tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of everything Ariana thought she knew. Considering, she repeated. For what? But she already knew. In the careful way his mother had asked about teaching before marriage. In the emphasis on proper lives and natural fits. In the way Min-jae had held her hand on the train like he was afraid she might disappear. Her name is Yoon Seo-rin, Min-jae said. Our families have known each other for generations. She's kind. She's intelligent. She works in traditional Korean art preservation. He stopped, swallowed. She's exactly what they want. And what do you want? Ariana asked, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. I want you. He said it fiercely, desperately, reaching for her hands. Ariana, I want you. Just as it's real. It's the most real thing in my life. But they chose someone else. It's not decided. Nothing is decided. I will, he struggled, his composure cracking in a way she'd never seen before. I'll make them understand. Ariana pulled her hands back slowly. She looked at this man she loved, this gentleman who read Hemingway in coffee shops and made her chamomile tea on rainy nights, and she saw the truth he couldn't say. He would try. He would mean to. But in the end, when it came down to choosing between the life he'd known for 32 years and the woman he'd known for 2, when his mother's disappointment became unbearable and his father's expectations became too heavy, when the weight of centuries of tradition pressed down on his shoulders, he would choose them. Not because he didn't love her, but because he'd been taught from birth that love wasn't enough, that duty came first, that a proper life mattered more than happiness. When do I meet her? Ariana asked. Min-jae flinched. You don't have to. When do I meet the woman your parents chose for you? There's a dinner. Next week. At our home in Seoul. His voice was barely audible. Mother insisted I bring you. She said. She said it would be good for everyone to understand the situation. Ariana closed her eyes. The situation. As if love could be reduced to something so clinical, so manageable. As if she hadn't just become the obstacle between the Kang family and their perfect plan. The train pulled into Seoul station as evening fell, the city lights coming alive like a million small promises. Ariana and Min-jae stepped onto the platform together, but for the first time since they'd met in that coffee shop 2 years ago, she felt the distance between them. Not in miles, not even in culture, but in the space between what he wanted and what he would do. Between the man who loved her and the son who would obey. And as they walked through the crowded station, Ariana realized with devastating clarity that she'd been living in a beautiful dream, a private world that could only exist as long as no one else was watching. Now they were watching, and the dream was ending.